Hi, I'm Full Offense. Welcome to my channel. Today, I want to talk in depth about one of my favorite Genshin characters and one of the best 4-stars in the game, the aspiring adventurer, Bennett. Before we get started, please like this video and maybe leave a comment if you enjoyed this guide. Liking and commenting helps my videos get pushed into the algorithm and it would really mean a lot to me. Go on, like it. Do it for Bennett. Starting the video off, I want to quickly cover two things regarding Bennett's constellations. The first thing is that while Bennett can function without his C1, C0 Bennett is very clunky, and I would almost consider C1 to be mandatory for him. The second thing, and this is something I think every other YouTuber that has ever talked about Bennett has also mentioned, do not confirm his C6. Even if you get a 7th Bennett and are able to take him to C6, just leave him at C5. C6 Bennett can only function as a support for Diluc, Hu Tao, Catalyst, and Bow DPS characters. This limits him greatly since he is one of the most versatile characters in the game. Let's first go over Bennett's more popular playstyle, Support. Later in this video, we'll learn about Melt DPS Bennett, which is one of my favorite playstyles, so be sure to watch until the end. For Support, there are two main artifact sets you can run on Bennett. The first and more popular is the Noblesse Oblige 4 set. Bennett's ult has a fairly low recast time and is very good at maintaining the 12-second Noblesse Oblige attack buff. The other main artifact set is to run a split set of the Noblesse Oblige 2 set and the Crimson Witch of Flames 2 set. This allows Bennett to do a good bit more damage while he's on the field, but you should only run this if you have another character on your team with the Noblesse Oblige 4 set. The stat priority for Support Bennett can get a little convoluted depending on how you want him to function. Energy Recharge is generally considered his most important stat because of how strong his Elemental Burst is. A good mix of crit rate and crit damage will allow him to hit fairly hard when he's on the field. Attack percent can be strong for him if you want to all-in him as a damage support, and Elemental Mastery can be good on him in Melt or Vaporize comps. Lastly, we have Health percent, which can be put anywhere except for above Energy Recharge depending on how much you want or need him to be able to heal for. For artifact main stats, we obviously have Health on the Flower and Flat Attack on the Feather. In regards to the other three, you can put attack percent, energy recharge, or health percent as the main stat on his sands, depending on your preference and which one you need. For Benny's Goblet, I would personally recommend pyro damage as the main stat, but you could run health percent if you only want him to heal. For his crown, you can run crit rate or crit damage, depending on which he would gain more Bennett fit from. If you really want to put the icing on the cake of making him a dedicated healer, you could get healing percent. Bennett's Elemental Burst, just at rank 6, provides an attack buff of 78% of Bennett's flat attack. This means that with fairly low investment, he can provide a 350 plus attack buff when he casts his ult. That can easily be a 20% or higher DPS increase for your main DPS. This really allows you to take your DPS to the moon. Even on top of that damage buff, Bennett's Elemental Burst also has very strong healing. The healing done scales off of Bennett's max HP, but even when built for damage, Bennett's Burst can provide more than substantial healing. While Bennett's Elemental Burst soaks up the spotlight, his Elemental skill still has its uses. His skill has an extremely low cooldown, and every time you use Bennett's Burst, you should use his skill immediately after. Additionally, Bennett's skill can be a very effective energy battery when supporting pyro carries, and can also be a source of pyro applications in reverse melt and vaporize teams. For Support Bennett, I would focus entirely on upgrading his Elemental Burst. If you build him to be able to do some damage, you'll also want to upgrade his Elemental skill, but it's a lower priority. And then upgrading his basic attack doesn't really do anything here. Bennett's support is extremely versatile when it comes to team building. You can almost fit him into any team comp in the game. He really shines when supporting for Vaporize or Melt comps, or even Overload comps, because he would most likely be triggering Pyro Resonance for another attack buff. But, due to the huge damage buff from his Elemental Burst, he can be an effective buff support even when he's the only Pyro on the team. A few examples of team comps with Support Bennett would be Melt comps like Yanfei, Rosaria, Kaya, and Bennett, in which Yanfei could be replaced for Diluc, Hu Tao, or Klee if you have them, and Rosaria or Kaya could be swapped out for a shielding character or an Anemo support. Another popular option is to run Bennett in a Pyro Vaporize comp, like Yanfei, Xingqiu, and Bennett. Then, for the fourth character, you could have Mona or a shield character, but here I would really recommend an Anemo support. Like with the Melt comps, Yanfei can also be swapped out for any other Pyro carry. You can also run a Hydro Vaporize comp, though our options here are much more limited. Child, Xiangling, and Bennett together and a shield or animo support can function very well. Lastly, you could also run an overload comp with a pyro carry, Fischl, Bennett, and again, a shield or animo support. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time here, as I could honestly make a whole video just about Bennett's weapons and the priority and all the situational values of each sword. Instead, I'm going to recommend a few 5 stars and 4 stars each. The first 5 star, and probably overall best weapon for support Bennett, is Aquila Favonia. It has, by far, the highest base attack of any sword, which means it gives Bennett the highest possible base attack and amps his burst to the max. Next up is the Skyward Blade. It has the 3rd highest base attack of swords, but also has scaling energy recharge, which is very strong for Bennett, and on top of that, gives him a bit of crit as well. It just gives a ton of stats. Now for the 4 stars. First up is the Alley Flash. This is the 4-star alternative to the Aquila Favonia. Alley Flash has the 2nd highest base damage of swords, and has by far the highest base damage of 4-star swords. Next is Festering Desire, if you have it, which I don't. It has good base damage and scaling energy recharge, as well as an effect that buffs the damage and crit rate of elemental skills. Lastly, we have the weapon I personally use on support Bennett, the Favonia Sword. It unfortunately has the lowest base damage of 4-star swords, but it has scaling energy recharge, and its effect allows critical hits to supply even more energy particles. That's all I have for support Bennett. As you can see, he isn't too complicated when you have a good understanding of how he works and how to build a team around him. Next, I'll be talking about a playstyle I find much more interesting, Melt DPS Bennett. Just like the support section, I'll start off with artifacts. The only real artifact set to run on Bennett as a main DPS is the Crimson Witch of Flame 4 set, as it is the set designed for pyro damage, and Bennett is made out of pyro damage. DPS Bennett's stat priority is much easier to explain than support Bennett's. Crit rate is going to be your main priority up to 70%. Try not to exceed 70%, but try to exceed it as little as possible, as you will start to get diminishing returns after that point. Crit damage is your next priority. You want to aim for a 1-to-2 ratio on crit rate to crit damage. That means in an ideal world, you would have 140% crit damage. However, those numbers are hard to achieve without godly artifacts, so I would recommend aiming for over 50% crit and over 100% crit damage. These numbers are much easier to achieve with a weapon that has scaling crit rate or scaling crit damage. After crit, we want to aim for Elemental Mastery and then Attack percent. For the artifact main stats, on the Sands piece, I would recommend Attack percent, but you could also do Elemental Mastery if you want. For his Goblet, you definitely want to go with Pyro damage. And for the Crown, you want crit rate or crit damage, depending on which you need more, which is probably crit rate. I covered Bennett's Elemental Burst pretty in depth in the support section of this guide. The main difference here is that instead of using Bennett's Burst to buff your main DPS, you're using it to buff your main DPS, which is Bennett. You're using it to buff yourself. However, Bennett's elemental skill plays a much larger role here. You're mainly going to want to tap his elemental skill and avoid holding it. With the short CD of 5 seconds, you can proc melts at a regular interval. Bennett's Ascension talents, Rekindle and Fear Not, reduce the cooldown of his elemental skill. His first Ascension talent, Rekindle, reduces it by 20% down to a 4-second cooldown. His second Ascension talent, Fear Not, reduces his skill cooldown by an additional separate 50% while standing within his elemental burst, Fantastic Voyage. This means he can trigger reactions at very fast 2-second intervals while also receiving the attack buff from his elemental burst. For DPS Bennett, I would recommend prioritizing his skill, then burst, and then auto attacks. You should get them all to level 6 and then rank up his skill and burst in alternating order so his skill is always equal to or above his burst's level. Alt DPS Bennett synergizes incredibly well with Chongyun. You can stack Chongyun's elemental skill and Bennett's elemental burst on top of each other. This allows Bennett to do the following combo: auto attack, charge attack, elemental skill. Doing this, you can proc melt on his skill every 2 seconds. To go even further beyond, Chongyun's second Constellation gives his elemental skill a 15% cooldown reduction effect, reducing the cooldown of Bennett's elemental skill down to 1.7 seconds. By the way, all this talk about Chongyun reminds me, my next video will be an in-depth guide to Chongyun. That video will be uploaded next week to my channel, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. Or, if it's already next week, I'll be sure to put a link to it in the description below. With Bennett and Chongyun together, you have many options for your last two slots. Xinyan or Diona would work very well with these two, as they can bring shielding options and they can complete an elemental resonance. I personally think that Xinyan would be more preferred here. Like most teams, an Anemo support could also be very valuable for their defense shredding, but I personally find that it feels a bit clunky with the fast-paced playstyle that Bennett has. You could also bring Kaya or Rosaria as sub-DPS characters for the extra cryo applications and for the extra crit rate from the cryo resonance. Quick note, I would avoid running 3 cryo characters on the same team as you're losing a bit of efficiency. So if you want to bring Kaya or Rosaria and you want a shield character, avoid bringing Diona. Another option is to replace Chongyun with Fischl for an overload comp. This playstyle is very similar, where Oz is applying Electro on every attack that Bennett does, and Bennett can proc a reaction with his skill off cooldown. This type of team doesn't have as many options for the other two members. I would recommend running an Anemo support and a shielding character, probably Shenyan or Zhongli if you have him. I would also only really recommend this if you have your Fischl at Constellation 6. So just like in the support section, I'm only going to go over a few noteworthy weapons for both 5-star and 4-star rarity. The best 5-star weapon for DPS Bennett is the Primordial Jade Cutter. It has scaling crit rate, which is always great to have, and its effect increases Bennett's max HP and gives an attack buff that scales off of his max HP. The Summit Shaper is also absurdly good on DPS Bennett. It has the 3rd highest base attack of swords, has scaling attack percent, and has an effect that increases attack even further. This weapon is really strong by itself, but even better if you have a shielding character on the team. The brand new Freedom Sworn, which just released, is probably just as good as the Summit Shaper, if not better, but it's too early for me to tell you for sure. One of the best 4-star weapons for DPS Bennett is the Iron Sting. It's a crafted weapon, making it a completely free-to-play option, and it is very strong at high refinement levels. The Black Sword from the Battle Pass is also very strong on him, as it has scaling crit rate, which you can never go wrong with. The Black Cliff Longsword from the Cycling Stargazer shop in Paimon's Bargains is also a very strong option. It has scaling crit damage and gives a stacking attack buff when killing enemies. Festering Desire is also good for him, but I'm not going to go over it because I don't have it and that makes me sad. This wraps up the information I have for DPS Bennett. Melt DPS Bennett is a playstyle I enjoy a ton, but I still use Bennett as a support pretty regularly. I love how versatile he is as a character and how fun he can be. I hope everyone who watched this video was able to learn something about our unlucky adventurer. At the time of me uploading this, Kazuha just released and Bennett is on the banner, so go get him, get C1, don't get C6, and build him to be the best. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. There will be more video guides on the way about other characters. If I missed anything, or if you have anything to say, leave me a comment. I'll be reading and interacting with my comment section to soak in the feedback. Also, I stream regularly on twitch.tv/FoolOffense, and I stream Genshin every Saturday. I will be pulling for Kazuha this Saturday, July 3rd, so be sure to come check it out. I also have a Discord server that I'll be interacting with quite a bit if you want to come give feedback or just say hi. There are links to both of those in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time with an in-depth Chongyun guide.